And welcome back. As we go ahead and continue looking at Python, we're now going to go ahead and jump right into introducing input and output. So let's first talk about getting input. Well, Python actually has a function known as input that allows us to get information from the console. And it's pretty easy to use. I can just say like x equals input. Unlike in Java, where we have to have a print line statement to give a prompt and then collect that information, in Python, we can directly give that prompt for input in the same line as that variable. So for example, x equals input, parentheses, quote, please enter a number. And that prompt will appear there and then, of course, capture that into the variable. We don't have to have two lines of code here. Now, what about generating output? Well, generating output is actually something we've already seen. All right, we can use the print function to display whatever we want to the console, such as a string, a number, whatever. Print, this is a line of text to be written. And of course, as we know, this would be a string literal that's being displayed out into the console here. We can also output the input we have gathered very easily. So it's, obviously, if we have an input, we want to, for example, maybe echo that back out, or we want to use it in some kind of operation. So for example, let's say I have x equals input, quote, type a number. Well, we can then say print x, and it will print out whatever number that we typed in for that input. All right, and of course, if we have input, we are sometimes going to need to have coercion. We want to specify what type, and this is a great way to make sure we're getting the valid inputs that we're expecting. So we want to specify the input. Let's say we want an integer, right? Well, we can typecast or coerce the type that we want. For example, I can say number is equal to int, parentheses, input, enter a number. Or floating num equals float, parentheses, input, parentheses, enter a decimal. Now, the one thing you need to take note of, if we look at this, the type we want it to be is always on the outside. So if I wanted it to be a string, for example, if I could do this the same thing with a string, I would just have to put the string here, then the input, and then the prompt. So again, these are all very important things to keep in mind, because if you say input and then you do the typecasting, it may not get you the results you want. In fact, you may even run some errors. So generally speaking, if we're doing something like this, we're getting an input from something, we want to make sure that that input is being casted here on the outside of that. Now, what about file handling? All right, we know about file I/O in Java. How do we do that here in Python? Well, Python can handle those files pretty well. We have a function for that, which is the open function. So I could say like a file equals open demo file.txt. However, because we're just starting to work with Python, and there's a lot more nuance when we start looking at file reading with Python, because you have different permissions that you can assign things, whether it's just reading or writing, etc. We're going to focus strictly on the console I/O. So kind of just like when we first started learning programming with Java, we didn't really deal too much with files. We're going to know, hey, it exists, but we want to focus more right now on the console so we can get some of like the ins and outs of Python down first before we start applying it out to greater things. And of course, you can always start taking some of those skills and start asking like, well, how can I do this? And of course, venture out on your own. But for our purposes, we're going to focus on the console. Now, there's one last thing I want to introduce today, which is the main function. And we're going to eventually start using functions, so it's good to get used to using them. For now, we're simply going to use what is known as the main function. And we can define this as follows: def main, parentheses, colon, a new line, and then you notice this is some code to be executed, but that code is tabbed over, meaning any code that is tabbed over there in that line is part of that function. And then at the bottom, you'll see we have main. All right, the function, of course, is called main, and we're invoking that at the very end of the program. And you'll notice when we get back to main, notice it's in the same line as the definition here, which means this is a new line of code that is expected here. It's not in the same indentation, and this is going to be something you see very common when you start working with functions and their invocations. All right, so here we are in Visual Studio Code. Let's go ahead and make up some code that we can do some input and output for. First thing I'm going to do, though, is I'm going to go ahead and define my main function, because even though I don't need it for what I'm doing right now, I want to start getting in that habit of having a properly built program so it's easier to execute. So I'm going to say def main, open close parentheses, colon, and if I hit enter, you'll see it automatically has tabbed me over. And that's telling me that anything I'm going to write from this point forward is going to be in this function. And so now that I'm in this function, let's go ahead and have it do some stuff for us. So for example, let's just have a variable. Let's just call this name. All right, and let's just have it get the input of a name. So we could, of course, just say input, and please enter your name. And this would be a perfectly good, valid variable for me to use. Let's say we want to get one for favorite number. All right, and now this time maybe I want to specify what this favorite number is. So I'm going to go ahead and say, I'm going to take an integer here, and I'm then going to get input, and please enter your favorite whole number. Or maybe I can do favorite integer. There we go. Keep it nice and specific here. And let's do another one. How about a decimal choice? All right. And we'll say float this time. Input, enter a decimal. And just for demonstration purposes, let's go ahead and show a typecast with a string. So let's just go ahead and say, we'll have one called another name. And we're going to call this str. And even though I don't need it for this input, because by default, input is a string, I can, of course, still typecast that on here and just say enter another name. All right, again, the str is not needed in this case because input is by default taking that in as a string value. So this is a little bit redundant, but I'm going to leave it there just for our demonstration purposes. And all I want to do is then do some print functions. So let's go ahead and print out your name is, and I'm just going to do a plus name. And let's print again. Let's say your friend's name is another name. And print your favorite number times a decimal is, and this one's going to get interesting. So I'm just going to go leave this on a one line here. And what I want to do, of course, is maybe I can, of course, use an escape character. For example, if I say like /n, we can have our escape characters that we're familiar with here. But I'm just going to go ahead and concatenate that with, say, fav num times decimal choice. And let's just see what this goes ahead and generates here. We'll find out here real quick. But let's just go ahead and make sure we close out this definition. Now, I noticed when I did this, I came down, hit enter, then hit enter one more time, and then hit the backspace key because I want to get back to this main indentation level. So then I'm just going to type main, and then open close parentheses here because I want to make sure that this is defining it as the function. So it always should match whatever our function name is, with including the parentheses. And the reason why you want the parentheses there is because what if we had a function that had parameters? So we have to have those parentheses there. All right, let's give this a run just to test it out. And I'm sure there's something I forgot here, but let's just go ahead and give this a quick run. And so we were getting a command here that says, please enter our name. All right, so I'm just going to call this about Smith. And please enter your favorite integer. Let's go ahead and just say 5. A decimal, let's say 2.5. And another name, how about Bill? And in here, oh, we have an error. Now, what is the error? It says can only concatenate string, not float to string. And if you look, that means this right here, when we multiply these two, if you think about it, an integer times a float, there's no needing to do any casting here because it's going to automatically determine that this is a float here because we have integer and float. However, we're trying to join in here with a string, which means I need to do a cast as a string. And this is when string casting comes into play here. So remember, I put one here and I said we don't actually need it here. In fact, I'm going to go ahead and take that off because input already functions as a string, so I'm going to leave there. However, right here, we needed one in place because this is trying to join it with a string. So that's one thing you have to keep in mind here with Python versus Java, is that it only, when it's doing the print function, it wants to really kind of behave with one type inside of it. So let's go ahead and rerun this, just see if we caught everything now. So we said Smith, 5, 2.5, Bill. All right, and notice this time I did not get that error, so that is good. And if we look, we got your name is Smith, your friend's name is Bill, your favorite number times the decimal is 12.5. Very good. And notice it came down a new line because I introduce this escape character here. Now, I didn't, of course, go over all those escape characters, but they're very familiar for what we might expect. So this, of course, is a new line escape character. And you can see that when I put it in there, it changed the color here in Visual Studio Code. And if I change this to /T, of course, that would have made this a tab. Most of these escape characters are not going to be very different from what we're used to in Java. But I decided to throw that in there just for kicks. And of course, it's very easy to go ahead and do any of these operations with Python, but this should give us a nice, good foundation for starting to handle some of this input and output